Something happened in Virginia around the year 2000 that I cannot stop thinking about. A school teacher, 40 years old, by every account a steady, decent man, married, stable, no history of trouble, no prior legal trouble, no prior anything. Then, gradually, something shifted. He began collecting child pornography. He began making advances on his stepdaughter. He was caught, convicted, and enrolled in a rehabilitation program. And then, on the night before he was to be expelled from that program for making advances on the staff there, he walked himself into an emergency room. He told them his head hurt. They scanned him. A large tumor was pressing against the front of his brain, against the orbitofrontal cortex, the region associated with impulse control, moral judgment, the ability to weigh what you desire against what you know is wrong. The tumor was removed surgically. Within weeks, the behavior stopped. He completed rehabilitation. He went home. About a year later, the behavior quietly started again. They scanned him again. The tumor had regrown in exactly the same location, a second removal. And once again, the behavior ceased. This is a documented medical case reported in the Archives of Neurology in 2003 by physicians J.M. Burns and R.H. Swerdlow. I want to be careful about what I say about it, because there is a version of this story that overstates the conclusion. The tumor was not a puppeteer pulling his strings. What it appears to have done, based on what followed its removal and regrowth, is alter the physical architecture of a specific region of his brain in such a way that certain behaviors followed from that alteration. Remove the tissue, the behaviors stop. Regrow the tissue, the behaviors return. And here is where I need you to sit with this. Not just the outrage, and not just the sympathy, not the legal question, the deeper one. If what he did arose from tissue, if the character of his choices tracked the state of 4 centimeters of abnormal brain matter, then who exactly was choosing? I'm going to hold that question open. Because the answer is not simple, and because what happened in that Virginia emergency room is actually the least strange piece of this puzzle. There is something happening right now in your own skull, in the ordinary business of every decision you feel yourself making. Something discovered decades before his tumor was found, in a lab with a volunteer, a clock, and a wrist. And it is, in its own quiet way, even more destabilizing. But not yet. Hold the question about the school teacher, because we're going to come back to it in a way that changes what it means. The book that started me down this particular rabbit hole is called Determined: A Science of Life Without Free Will. It was published in 2023. Its author is Robert M. Sapolsky, a biologist and neurologist who spent decades at Stanford University studying the connection between genetics, hormones, brain chemistry, and behavior. Sapolsky is not making a philosophical argument in the traditional sense. He is not a philosopher in an armchair reasoning from first principles. He is a scientist who synthesized 50 years of research in endocrinology, evolutionary biology, developmental neuroscience, and genetics into a single cumulative case. The case that at no point in the biological chain that produces a human decision is there a gap where an uncaused you steps in and takes over. That framing matters. Not, is the universe deterministic in a physics sense? Not, do you feel like you have free will? The specific question is, where in the actual sequence of biological causes that leads to any choice you make, would you put it? Where, precisely, does the unencumbered author of your actions live? I went into this expecting to push back. I came out unable to unthink it. But I don't want to start with Sapolsky's argument yet. I want to start with something simpler, because the thing Sapolsky is doing at the scale of a whole life, someone else did much earlier at the scale of a single wrist movement, and that is where this story should begin. In the early 1980s, a neurophysiologist at the University of California, San Francisco, named Benjamin Libet, ran an experiment that has been quoted and disputed and worried over for 40 years. The setup was elegantly simple. A volunteer sits in a chair, their wrist is relaxed, in front of them is a specialized clock, a dot moving rapidly around a circular display. The instructions are, flex your wrist whenever you feel like it. No schedule, no signal, just whenever the urge comes. And when it does, note where the dot is on the clock face. That's the whole task. Flex your wrist when you want to. Note the clock when you first feel the urge to do so. Meanwhile, EEG electrodes on the scalp are recording the volunteer's brain activity the whole time. Specifically, they are watching for a slow buildup of electrical activity in the motor regions of the brain called the readiness potential, a gradual ramp-up that precedes voluntary movement. This signal had been described by neurophysiologists Kornhuber and Dika in the 1960s, and Libet's insight was to use it as a probe. When does the brain actually begin preparing the action compared to when the person consciously feels they decided to act? Here is what the data showed. The readiness potential, the brain's preparatory ramp, began on average roughly 550 milliseconds before the wrist moved. That's a little over half a second. And the volunteers reported first becoming aware of the urge to move approximately 200 milliseconds before the movement. So the math works out like this. Conscious awareness of the intention arrived about 200 milliseconds before the action. But the brain had already been preparing that action for roughly 550 milliseconds, which means the brain was building toward this movement for approximately 350 milliseconds before the person had any conscious awareness of deciding to move. 350 milliseconds is not a long time. It is less than the blink of an eye, but it is not nothing. And what it appears to show is this. Your brain begins preparing a voluntary action before you consciously decide to perform it. The action is already underway, below awareness, before the thought, "I'll move now," arrives. The results were published in the journal Brain in 1983. I want you to pause on this, not on the numbers, on what the numbers describe. You are sitting in a chair. You feel a spontaneous urge arise. You think, "I'll move now." That feeling, the feeling of intending, the feeling of authoring, arrives after the neural process that will produce the movement has already begun. What you experience as the moment of decision may be closer to a notification than a command. Now. Libet himself did not conclude from this that free will was dead. He proposed what he called a veto, the idea that even if the conscious mind doesn't initiate the action, it might be able to cancel it in the narrow window before the movement completes. The unconscious brain fires up the process. Consciousness can still pull the brake. Whether that rescue is philosophically coherent, whether the veto is itself pre-decided, is a question we will need to come back to. But Libet was careful. He did not claim his experiment proved free will was an illusion. Other researchers were less restrained, and then, in 2008, something happened that made the Libet result look modest. John Dylan Haynes is a neuroscientist who worked at the Bernstein Center for Computational Neuroscience in Berlin. In 2008, he and colleagues including Chun Seong Soon ran a study using an fMRI scanner, a machine that tracks blood flow through the brain and can identify which regions are most active at any given moment. The participants lay inside the scanner watching letters appear on a screen. They could press a button with either their left or right hand whenever they felt like it, and they were asked to note which letter was on screen when they first felt the urge to decide which hand to use. The question the experiment was asking was simple and unsettling. By watching your brain before you make a choice, can we tell which choice you're going to make? The answer, within very specific limits, was yes. Activity patterns in two regions, the frontopolar cortex and the precuneus, predicted which hand the participant would choose up to 7 to 10 seconds before the participant reported feeling any urge to decide. The accuracy was approximately 60%. Chance for a left or right choice is 50%. Now I want to be precise here, because this result gets inflated all the time and the inflation is dishonest. 60% is not dramatic. It is 10 percentage points above random guessing. The choices being predicted were simple, arbitrary, low-stakes motor decisions, left button or right button, with no values, no consequences, no deliberation attached to them. This tells us nothing, directly, about complex decisions like who to marry, whether to quit your job, what you believe. The researchers were not reading the future of meaningful human choices. They were detecting faint statistical patterns in neural activity preceding a coin flip with your hands. State that clearly, then state what remains. Even with all those qualifications, activity in your brain, activity that is invisible to your awareness, contains information about what you are about to do before you feel you've decided to do it. The gap in Libet's study was less than a second. In Haynes's study, it extended to nearly 10. Something is happening in the machinery before the readout arrives on your conscious screen. This is the published record from Nature Neuroscience 2008. The paper exists. The numbers are what they are. The question is what they mean, and that is where things get genuinely contested. But before we go there, I need to come back to Virginia, because the tumor case sitting next to these two experiments changes what the tumor case means. Look at the three findings in sequence. Libet. Your brain begins preparing voluntary movement before you consciously intend it, a gap of about 350 milliseconds. Haynes. Simple choices can be decoded from brain activity up to 10 seconds in advance at modest accuracy. Burns and Swerdlow. A man's moral character and behavior tracked with apparent precision the growth and removal of a specific mass of tissue. The scale keeps expanding. We started at milliseconds. We moved to seconds. Now we're talking about months, about character, about who someone fundamentally is. The lesson of the Virginia case, taken carefully, not overinterpreted, is not that behavior is controlled by tumors. It is that even what we call moral character, even the deep dispositions we associate with selfhood, can be altered by physical changes to specific regions of the brain. We do not need to believe in neuroscientific determinism to notice that. The finding is documented. A person's worst impulses appeared, stopped, reappeared, and stopped again, in lockstep with the physical state of a particular piece of brain tissue. And when you place that next to the Libet result, something clicks into focus. In Libet's lab, the decision to move a wrist appeared to be downstream of neural preparation that preceded conscious awareness. In the Virginia hospital, an entire pattern of moral behavior appeared to be downstream of tissue state. The only difference is the timescale and the complexity of the action. The structural picture is the same. Behavior follows from brain state, and brain state is itself the product of prior causes: biological, developmental, chemical. Robert Sapolsky's argument in Determined is that this pattern holds all the way down and all the way back. Not just for wrist flicks, not just for pathological cases, for every decision you make, every day without exception. Here is how he traces it. Take any choice, a real one, not a lab choice, a life choice, a choice you are proud of or ashamed of. This morning's first decision, go backward 1 second. Your neurons were already mid-pattern. The specific configuration of activation in your prefrontal cortex, the region that handles planning, impulse control, weighing consequences, was already forming before the decision reached awareness. Go back to that morning. Your cortisol levels, which regulate stress and risk tolerance, were shaped by how you slept, which was shaped by how anxious you've been lately. Your testosterone levels, which influence aggression and confidence, were set by a hormonal profile that was itself a product of your recent history. The biochemical state you woke up in wasn't neutral. It was already tilted. And you did not choose it. Go back months. If you've been under sustained stress, your prefrontal cortex has been operating at reduced capacity. Stress physically impairs the brain region most associated with deliberate self-control. If you experienced sleep deprivation, same thing. You made this choice with a brain that had already been shaped by everything that preceded today. Go back to childhood. If you experienced early adversity, poverty, abuse, instability, there is strong evidence that your HPA axis, the hormonal stress response system, was permanently recalibrated. Your baseline response to threat and challenge was set in early development in ways you did not choose and cannot fully override. Go back further. Your genes, the specific variants of your dopamine receptors, your serotonin transporters, your propensity for impulsivity or conscientiousness, were determined at fertilization. You inherited them from two people whose genomes you did not select. Those variants affect your thresholds, your sensitivities, the entire texture of how your brain responds to experience. Go back before that. Those genetic variants survived across generations because of selection pressures in your ancestral environment, environments of scarcity, threat, competition that had nothing to do with the values or preferences of any conscious chooser. Go back to the beginning of everything. At what point in that entire chain does the gap appear? Where is the moment where an uncaused you, a you that is not itself the product of prior causes, steps in? Sapolsky's answer is that there is no such moment, not because he can prove it with certainty, but because no one has ever found it. Every time you look for the place where cause stops and pure authorship begins, there is only more cause. The chooser keeps dissolving into the conditions that made it. I want to say clearly, this is an argument, not a proven fact. Sapolsky is a scientist making a philosophical case, and there are philosophers, serious ones, who dispute the conclusion while accepting every one of the biological premises. We will get to them. That dispute matters, and I don't want to hide it. But I want you to really sit with the structure of the argument first, because the structure is what makes it so difficult to find the exit. Think of it this way. You are trying to find the point in a river where the water chose its own course. You follow it back, from the estuary to the tributaries, from the tributaries to the headwaters, from the headwaters to the snowpack, from the snowpack to the weather system that deposited it. Everywhere you look, the water is going where the terrain was already cut, by geology, by rainfall, by the million prior events that made the valley it flows through. The water is real. Its movement is real. But the choice of direction, the independent authorship of the river's path, is nowhere to be found. There is only the valley. Your decision is the water. Your entire prior history, biological, developmental, genetic, cultural, cosmological, is the valley. Now, before I go any further, I want to raise something that will have occurred to some of you already, because it's the most common escape route, and it deserves an honest answer. Quantum mechanics. You may have heard that quantum physics introduced genuine randomness into the universe, that at the subatomic level, events occur that are not in principle predictable, not caused by anything that came before. And if the universe is not deterministic all the way down, doesn't that open the door for free will? Doesn't the randomness leave room for something uncaused to get in? This is worth taking seriously. It is not a stupid question, but follow it carefully, because the answer is not what you might hope. If a random quantum event, some unpredictable firing at the subatomic level, is what actually produces your decision, then that event is not under your control any more than a coin flip is. Randomness is not agency. A choice that was caused by prior states is not authored by you. But a choice that was produced by random noise is also not authored by you. You didn't cause the randomness any more than you caused the deterministic chain. In neither case did the choice originate with something we can call you. The space where a genuinely free will could live, something that is neither caused by prior states nor merely random, appears on reflection to be empty. This is a standard argument in philosophy of mind, versions of which appear in the work of Sam Harris in his 2012 book Free Will and in the work of the philosopher Peter van Inwagen. It does not mean the argument is settled. Philosophical libertarians who defend free will have responses to it, but the responses do not involve simply pointing at quantum uncertainty and saying, "There's your freedom." That move doesn't work. What about the more specific claim that quantum indeterminacy in the brain might somehow be the mechanism of free will? There are theorists who have argued this, most notably Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff, who propose that quantum processes in structures inside neurons called microtubules might be relevant to consciousness and choice. Mainstream neuroscience is skeptical of this, and we are not going to build anything on it here. Not because it's obviously wrong, but because it's not established, and building an argument for free will on an unconfirmed mechanism in order to resist an inconvenient conclusion would be bad intellectual practice. We will not do that. So the quantum escape hatch, as far as the mainstream understanding goes, doesn't lead anywhere useful. Let me introduce you to a thought experiment that has been around since 1814, because it frames everything that follows with uncomfortable clarity. Pierre-Simon Laplace was a French mathematician and astronomer who, in 1814, in a work called A Philosophical Essay on Probabilities, described something that philosophers have been calling Laplace's demon ever since. Here's the idea. Imagine a vast intellect, not a person, just an intelligence of unlimited capacity that knows the exact position and velocity of every particle in the universe at a single moment in time. Armed with the laws of physics, this intellect calculates forward. From the complete state of the universe at one instant, it derives everything that follows, every motion, every collision, every chemical reaction, every electrical signal in every human brain. For such an intellect, Laplace argued, the entire future is already readable in the present. Nothing is hidden, nothing is uncertain. The whole of history, forward and backward, is contained in any single snapshot of the universe's state. You are a configuration of particles. Your next decision is what a specific arrangement of matter does next, given the laws of physics applied to its current state. Now, I want to be scrupulously fair about what this thought experiment does and does not establish. It does not prove that determinism is true. Quantum mechanics introduced genuine indeterminacy that wasn't on Laplace's radar. He was working within a Newtonian framework. It does not prove that even if classical determinism were true, any actual intellect could pull off this calculation. The computational demands would be absurd. And it does not prove that determinism, even if true, eliminates moral responsibility. The compatibilists we'll get to in a moment reject exactly that inference. What it does do is put the picture on the table with complete clarity. If the universe is a causal system, if the present state of things follows necessarily from the prior state and the laws that govern it, then every configuration of matter that will ever exist, including every thought you will ever think, was implicit in the state of things before you were born. The demon might be impossible in practice. The logic is still what it is. Think of it like a film on a reel. The movie has been shot. The choices the characters make, the reversals, the moments of decision, they exist in fixed form on the reel before you press play. The characters believe they are making choices in real time. They are. The choices are real events. They are also already there, fixed, before the projector starts. You are watching a film that is convinced it is making itself up as it goes. That image should bother you slightly more than it does. In 1983, a philosopher named Peter van Inwagen published a book called An Essay on Free Will, and in it, he laid out what has become known as the consequence argument. I want to walk you through it step by step because the logic is remarkably tight. If determinism is true, your actions are consequences of the laws of nature plus the state of the world before you were born. You have no control over the laws of nature. You have no control over the past before your birth. Therefore, you have no control over the consequences of those things, including your actions. That's it. That is the whole argument. And it's worth spending a moment with it, because it doesn't feel right. We feel in control. We feel like we deliberate. We feel like we could have done otherwise. And yet the logic seems to close around us without any obvious exit. If your action is a consequence of things you had no hand in setting up, in what sense is it yours? The philosopher Daniel Dennett, who has spent decades defending a version of free will, would say that van Inwagen is defining control too narrowly. Dennett's argument, developed in his books Elbow Room from 1984 and Freedom Evolves from 2003, is that the free will worth having is not about being uncaused. It's about acting on your own reasons, your own values, your own character, without external coercion or compulsion. A person who does what they genuinely want to do, for reasons they actually endorse, is free, even in a deterministic universe. Being determined by your own character is not the same as being a puppet. I want to give this position its proper weight, because it is not a dodge. Compatibilism, the view that free will and determinism are compatible, is arguably the dominant position in academic philosophy. It is held by serious, careful thinkers who are not confused about the neuroscience or the physics, and the intuition behind it is real. There's a genuine difference between a man who gives you his wallet because he wants to give it to you, and a man who gives you his wallet because you're pointing a gun at him. In the second case, we say he wasn't free. In the first, we say he was. And that difference matters, even in a deterministic universe. Sapolsky's reply, and this is where the live disagreement sits, is that even your own reasons and values are the output of prior causes. The distinction between external and internal compulsion begins to dissolve when you trace the internal far enough back. Your own values were installed by a culture you were born into, a family you didn't choose, a brain with specific sensitivities you didn't design. The puppet that holds its own strings still had its strings attached from outside. I am not going to tell you who is right here. I genuinely don't know. These are some of the most capable people thinking about these questions, and they disagree. What I can tell you is that the disagreement is not resolvable by just repeating the intuition that you feel free. The feeling is the thing in question. There is a thought experiment by the philosopher Harry Frankfurt. He was at Princeton, and he published it in 1971 in the Journal of Philosophy. That is worth pausing on because it cuts in an unexpected direction. Here is the scenario. Imagine a neuroscientist has secretly implanted a device in your brain. The device is designed to monitor your thoughts, and if it detects that you are about to choose option Y instead of option X, it will activate and make you choose X. But here's the twist. The device is never activated because you always choose X on your own. Now, it looks like you could not have done otherwise. The device would have intervened if you'd tried. In the standard philosophical framing, that seems to undermine your responsibility. If you couldn't have done otherwise, how are you responsible for what you did? And yet, most people's intuition is that you are still responsible. You chose X. No intervention occurred. You acted on your own reasons. The device never had to fire. Frankfurt's point is this: could have done otherwise might not be the right criterion for moral responsibility. What matters is not whether an external force could have prevented you from deviating, but whether you actually acted on your own reasons without coercion. This is a Steelman for the compatibilist position, and I think it deserves respect. The intuition it captures is real. But here is what Sapolsky would say in response. The Frankfurt case grants that you acted on your own reasons. It just asks whether an external device prevented alternatives. What Sapolsky's argument adds is, your own reasons are themselves the product of prior causes you didn't choose. The device in Frankfurt's scenario intervenes at the moment of choice. Biology intervened before you were born. The question isn't whether you acted on your reasons. The question is how your reasons got there. And that question Frankfurt's scenario doesn't touch. There is another thought experiment that takes this further. It comes from the philosopher Dirk Pereboom, who teaches at Cornell, and he published it in a book called Living Without Free Will in 2001. The scenario goes like this. Imagine a person whose brain was secretly programmed from birth by scientists, not with a device that intervenes at the moment of choice like Frankfurt's, something more fundamental. Their values, their personality, their patterns of reasoning, their emotional responses, all of it was installed before they were old enough to resist or consent. They grow up, they live their life, they act on those values and make those choices. And we say, they can't be fully responsible. They were manipulated. The desires they acted on weren't really theirs. They were planted. Now, Pereboom's question. What is the morally relevant difference between that person and you? You were also shaped before you could consent. Your values and personality did not emerge from some prior self who sat down and selected them. They emerged from genetics you didn't choose, from a family environment you didn't pick, from a culture you were born into, from developmental experiences that altered your brain before you had any say in the matter. The difference is that the forces that shaped you were not scientists with a deliberate agenda. They were nature and circumstance. But is that difference morally relevant? The manipulation was impersonal. Does that make it less total? Compatibilists have responses to this. Dennett and others argue that the manipulation cases are subtly disanalogous to normal development in ways that matter. The manipulation scenario involves deception and external agents with intentions. Normal development, even if causally complete, is a different kind of process. The debate here is ongoing and genuinely difficult, but I want you to feel the force of Per Boom's version before we move past it. Because the intuition it targets is real. There is something troubling about holding people in contempt for who they became, when who they became was not something they ever fully steered. Here's the trap that closes last, and the one I find hardest to escape. You are watching this video, you're thinking about the argument, you feel a kind of resistance, perhaps intellectual, perhaps emotional. You decide to engage critically, you decide to push back, or to accept it, or to bracket it and come back to it later. You are deliberating, you feel it. But here's the question Sapolsky presses in. Determined, where did that response come from? Your willingness to engage with a difficult idea or to resist it is itself a product of your intellectual temperament, which is a product of your education, your curiosity, the specific dopamine reward your particular brain gets from novel ideas, which are products of your genetics, your developmental history, your biochemistry. Even your objection to determinism was determined. Even your sense that the argument must have an escape, that there must be something wrong with it, arrived pre-formed in the kind of mind you have, built from causes you did not choose. The argument swallows the objector. Think of a calculator sophisticated enough to narrate its own operations. I considered all the inputs. I weighed the possibilities. I decided the answer was 7. It didn't decide anything. It computed. The narration is accurate about what happened. The computation is real. But it is not accurate about what the narration means. Now, imagine the calculator genuinely believes its own narration. That is, at minimum, a reasonable description of what might be happening inside you right now. I find this genuinely uncomfortable to sit with, not because I'm sure it's right, but because the usual move when you feel trapped by an argument, let me think my way out of this, is exactly the move the argument says is itself trapped. Every attempt to reason your way to freedom is being executed by the same determined machinery the argument describes. There's a brief window, right now, where you can feel this loop tighten. I recommend noticing it. Let me now do something that is both honest and necessary. Let me give the skeptical position its real due. The Scherger reinterpretation of Liebet. Aaron Scherger, a neuroscientist who at the time was working in France and later held positions at Chapman University in Princeton, published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2012. His argument was about the readiness potential, the signal Liebet had measured and taken to be a decision forming before awareness. Scherger's claim, the readiness potential is not a decision signal, it is noise. Here is what he means. The brain is constantly generating random fluctuations of electrical activity, neurons firing and settling and firing again, driven by no particular goal, just the inherent noisiness of a biological system. These fluctuations are stochastic. They drift up and down unpredictably. Every so often, by chance, the noise climbs high enough to cross a threshold. When it does, the motor system fires. The movement happens. In Liebet's paradigm, participants are told to move whenever they feel like it. They are in a state of readiness, waiting to act. In that state, the brain's random fluctuations are already loaded close to the threshold. When the noise happens to climb steeply, which it does randomly, the participant experiences what they interpret as the urge to move. Of course, the readiness potential looks like it precedes the urge. Participants naturally notice the urge at the moment the noise is already climbing toward threshold. They're going to misplace the moment of decision toward a moment when neural activity is already elevated. The readiness potential didn't build toward a decision, it just crossed a threshold. If Scherger is right, and his reinterpretation is taken seriously, though it's contested, then Liebet didn't show that your brain decides before you do. He showed that motor threshold crossing precedes movement. That's less dramatic. The brain is not forming decisions in the dark ahead of your awareness. It is doing what biological systems do, generating noise until something happens. I want to be clear about what this does and does not do. If Scherger's model is correct, It weakens one specific argument for hard determinism, the "your brain commits before you do" argument, but it does not establish free will. Even in Schurger's model, the movement is produced by prior brain states and thresholds in stochastic processes. The choice, such as it is still caused, just stochastically rather than deterministically. Randomness, as we already established, is not the same as freedom. What Schurger's work does do is make the neuroscience more honest. The readiness potential story, as it circulates in popular accounts, tends to overstate its own implications. The real picture is murkier and more interesting. And in this video, murky and honest is better than clean and wrong. I said there is something that sits at the intersection of neuroscience, physics, and philosophy that is more uncomfortable than any one of them alone. Let me put the three pictures next to each other. Neuroscience says this: the brain initiates action before conscious awareness of intention. Behavior tracks brain state. Brain state tracks prior causes: genetic, developmental, hormonal, cultural. What you call your character is substantially a product of forces that were operating long before you had any capacity to reflect on them. The individual mechanisms here are well established. The anti-free will conclusion drawn from them is an interpretation, a serious one, but not proven. Physics says this: the classical Newtonian picture is one of a closed causal system. Every state of the universe follows from the prior state, given the laws of nature. If that picture is correct, then every particle configuration, including every thought you will ever have, was implicit in the state of things before the solar system formed. Quantum mechanics breaks that picture at the smallest scales by introducing genuine indeterminacy. But quantum indeterminacy does not obviously propagate to the scale of neural decision-making in any way most neuroscientists find plausible. And even if it did, randomness is not freedom. Philosophy says this: there is no coherent account of what free will would even mean if it required being uncaused. A will that is neither caused by prior states nor random is not described by any physics we know. The compatibilist alternative, that freedom means acting on your own reasons without coercion, is genuinely compelling, but your own reasons trace back to causes you didn't install. None of these three fields contradict each other. That is what makes the picture uncomfortable. They triangulate. Each one, from its own angle, arrives at the same shape, a system with no obvious gap for an uncaused author. This is the part that genuinely unsettled me, not any one of the findings, the convergence. You can dismiss a neuroscience paper. You can argue with a philosopher. When evolutionary biology, developmental neuroscience, classical physics, quantum mechanics, and philosophy all arrive at a picture that excludes the kind of free will most of us believe we have, not by design, not as a coordinated project, but simply because each discipline keeps following its own thread. That is harder to dismiss. Think of it this way. You're in a room and you're trying to find the door. You try the north wall. Solid. You try the east wall, solid. The south wall, the west wall. None of this tells you with certainty that there is no door. Maybe it's in the ceiling. Maybe you haven't looked carefully enough, but there is a point at which the absence of evidence starts to feel like evidence of absence. The room keeps being solid. I'm not saying free will doesn't exist. I'm saying that everyone who has looked carefully at the walls has found them solid. And the feeling that there must be a door, that feeling too was generated by a brain you didn't build. Here is what Sapolsky lands on as a practical consequence, and I think it deserves the same careful attention as the argument itself. If no decision is truly the product of an uncaused author, if the worst thing a person does is the output of a causal chain they did not originate, then what happens to blame? Not legal accountability, not the structures we use to contain harm and protect each other. Those can survive this picture, and Sapolsky acknowledges as much. We can still separate dangerous people from people they might hurt. We can still create incentive structures, consequences, interventions. None of that requires a retributive notion of desert. What changes is the contempt, the moral rage, the deep sense that someone fundamentally deserves to suffer because they chose it freely, chose it when they could have done otherwise, chose it against the pull of their better nature. If their nature was itself shaped by forces they didn't choose, then what exactly are we punishing? We are punishing the output of a causal chain that started before they were born. We are holding the river responsible for the shape of the valley. I find this implication both unsettling and, I want to say this carefully, somewhat clarifying. Not as a license, not as a reason to abandon accountability, but as a reason to examine the emotional texture of how we treat each other when we think they've failed. The man in Virginia did not choose his tumor. He did not choose what the tumor did to the circuitry of his moral judgment. He did not choose to become someone who would do what he did. And when the tumor was removed, the person who did those things was gone, or at least substantially altered. Which one was him? The question about identity, about which configuration of the brain is really you, opens something deeper. You have a sense of yourself as a continuous thing, a self that woke up this morning, that has opinions and memories and values, that is watching this video and making decisions about how to respond to it. That sense of continuity feels rock solid. It feels like the most certain thing about your experience. But what is it made of? Your brain is not static. Neurons form new connections and abandon old ones. The hormonal state you're in right now is different from what it was an hour ago and different from what it will be in an hour. The prefrontal cortex that is doing the most U-shaped thing, deliberating, reflecting, weighing, is itself the product of decades of experience that laid down specific patterns and dispositions. The you that is making choices today is a different biological configuration than the you who made choices a decade ago. Partly because of choices you made then, partly because of things that happened to you, partly because of changes in your brain chemistry you never authorized. The self is less like a stone and more like a wave. A wave is a real thing. It moves, it has shape and direction, it can knock you over. But it is not made of fixed material. It is a pattern moving through water. The water is always changing. What persists is the pattern, for a while. And then the pattern changes too. Your sense of being a continuous chooser moving through time may be closer to the wave than to the stone. A real pattern, a generated shape, not a fixed substance doing the choosing. This is where the tumor case lands differently when you've been through all of this. The question, who was he really? The man who did those things, or the man who stopped when the tissue was removed, is not a sentimental question. It is a question about what he refers to. If his character was a function of his brain state, and his brain state changed, then he changed. The identity that we hold legally and morally accountable is itself a temporal slice of a biological configuration that is always in motion. And that applies not just to him. It applies to the self you think of as you. I want to come back to the Libet result one more time, because there is a piece of it that rarely gets the attention it deserves. Libet himself, as I mentioned, did not conclude that free will was gone. He proposed the veto, the idea that even if conscious awareness doesn't initiate action, it might be able to cancel it. The brain starts revving. Consciousness hits the brake. But notice what happens when you press on the veto. If the veto is a real capacity, if you can consciously cancel an impulse in the 200 millisecond window, then ask, what caused the veto? What is the mechanism by which you decide to cancel rather than proceed? If the answer is prior brain states, prior training, prior values, then the veto is itself caused. It is not an uncaused capacity slotted in from outside. It is another output of the same machine, which means that the presence or absence of the veto was itself determined. The veto rescue, as a piece of philosophy, has a hole in it. And yet, there is something morally real about the capacity to pause, the ability to notice an impulse before acting on it, to hesitate, to draw on values and training. These capacities are real. They vary across people and circumstances, and they matter for how we treat each other. Sapolsky would not deny this. He would say those capacities are themselves the product of prior causes. A person with a more developed capacity to pause didn't choose to develop it. They were shaped by experiences, by practice, by a prefrontal cortex that happened to wire itself in a particular way. The capacity is real. The authorship of it is the thing in question. The prefrontal cortex, it keeps coming up. Let me say something specific about it because it matters for how we think about development and responsibility. The prefrontal cortex is the region most associated with the functions we consider most human. Impulse control, moral reasoning, planning, the ability to weigh long-term consequences against immediate desires. And it is the last region of the brain to complete development. Full myelination, the insulation of neural pathways that makes transmission fast and reliable, is not complete until approximately age 25. This is a biological fact. It is not controversial, and it has direct implications for how we think about decisions made before that point. When a 16-year-old makes a catastrophic choice, they are doing so with a prefrontal cortex that is not yet structurally complete. The hardware that handles long-term risk assessment and impulse suppression is still being built. We already accept this, partially. We have different legal standards for minors, but Sapolsky's argument pushes the question, why does the developmental incompleteness stop being morally relevant at 25? At 25, the hardware is built, but it was built by the same forces that built the 16-year-olds. The person at 25 is more fully formed. They are not less caused. I'm not suggesting this makes accountability impossible. I am following the thread where it goes. There is one more layer to this that I haven't mentioned yet, the deepest trap of all. And I want to place it carefully, because it's easy to state too quickly and lose. The feeling of freedom. Not the question of whether you are free, the feeling. Right now, reading this, you have a sense that you could stop. You could look away, close the tab, go make a cup of tea. You feel that this is genuinely open, that the next moment is unwritten and you hold the pen. That feeling is real. It is not a mistake. It is not going away. But here is what the science of consciousness suggests, and this is where things get genuinely vertiginous. The feeling of freedom is itself generated. It is produced below awareness by the brain as part of the ongoing narrative the self constructs about its own agency. The sense that you are the author of your next moment is not direct perception of something metaphysical. It is an inference, a model, a construction that the brain builds and presents to you as experience. And the construction cannot be dismantled from inside. You cannot choose to feel unfree. You cannot will yourself out of the sensation of willing. Even if you accept every argument in this video, even if you become fully intellectually convinced that your choices are the output of prior causes, you will still feel tomorrow morning, when you reach for the coffee, that you are making a free choice. The feeling does not yield to the argument. The illusion, if that is what it is built into the architecture. You cannot opt out of the experience of being a chooser. Even the attempt to opt out is felt as a choice. This is what I mean when I say the trap is total. Not that the argument is certainly correct, but that even if it is correct, the corrective information cannot reach the machinery that generates the experience it describes. The felt sense of authoring your life is upstream of philosophy, upstream of neuroscience, upstream of anything this video can do to it. You will walk away from here feeling free. And that feeling will have been generated by processes that were already running before you pressed play. Let me tell you about the thought you had this morning that felt entirely like yours. You woke up and something occurred to you. Maybe a worry, maybe a plan, maybe a memory that surfaced without invitation. You did not decide to think it, it arrived. You found yourself already thinking it, and you took it as your thought, your concern, your idea, because it emerged inside your skull and carried your characteristic texture. Sam Harris, in his 2012 book Free Will, makes what I think is the most immediate version of this observation. He asks you to notice where your next thought comes from. Right now. Try it. Before the next sentence arrives, where does it come from? Can you predict it? Can you decide in advance exactly what your mind will serve up? Or does it simply appear and then you identify with it and call it yours? You did not choose the thought. The thought arose, and then the sense of ownership followed. This is not the same as saying the thought is meaningless or that it doesn't reflect who you are. It does reflect who you are. But who you are is the very thing whose origins are in question. There is a version of you that feels entirely self-authored, a continuous narrator, observing and deciding, moving through experience with something like agency. And then there is what the evidence seems to describe, a biological process that generates experiences, generates thoughts, generates the feeling of deciding, and then generates a narrator who experiences all of that as chosen. Which one is reporting accurately? Here is an image I keep returning to. Think of the autopilot on an aircraft. The plane is flying, banking left, adjusting altitude, making thousands of micro-corrections per second based on incoming data. Then imagine a voice in the cockpit, a narrator, that says in a measured tone, "I have decided to bank left." Both things are true. The plane banked left. The narrator said it decided to, but the narrator did not cause the banking. The banking was already happening before the narration began. The narration is accurate about the outcome and inaccurate about the causation. Now ask, is the narrator lying? Not exactly. It genuinely represents what happened. It just mislabels its own role in it. This is one coherent reading of what conscious deliberation is, a real process generating real experience, reporting accurately on outcomes, but arriving after the relevant causal work is done. The image that troubles me more than this one is the next step. You, right now, might be the narrator. You might be the voice in the cockpit of a plane that is already banked. Every thought you are having about this video, every response you feel forming, every sense of evaluating and deciding, it may be arriving after the relevant neural processes have already committed. You experience it as authoring. You may be narrating. I want to be careful here about what that does and doesn't mean for your experience. The experience is real. Let me say that clearly. The sense of deliberating, of weighing, of caring about what you do, that is not a hallucination. It is a real feature of being a conscious creature. The question is not whether the experience exists. The question is whether the experience accurately represents its own causal role. A thermometer responds to temperature. The mercury rises. That rising is a real physical event. Now imagine the thermometer also generates a sensation, a feeling of warmth that corresponds to the mercury's position. The feeling is real. The thermometer genuinely experiences something, but the feeling did not cause the temperature. It is a readout, not a lever. What if conscious experience is more like the feeling in the thermometer than like a hand on the controls? Real, vivid, present, and downstream of the thing it seems to be guiding? The question of whether consciousness actually does causal work, whether the felt experience of deciding genuinely influences what your body does, or whether it is a passenger that arrives after the driver has already committed, is one of the hardest open questions in the science of mind. The philosopher's term for the passenger version is epiphenomenalism. I'm not going to pretend it's resolved because it isn't. Serious people defend it and serious people reject it. What I can say is this: the experiments we've covered, Leibott's readiness potential, Haynes's scanner, the biological mechanisms Sapolsky catalogs, are at least consistent with the passenger interpretation. They do not prove it, but they do not rule it out. And the assumption that consciousness is doing the steering rather than providing the narration has more going against it than popular intuition would suggest. There is a detail about the Haynes study that I didn't dwell on long enough, and I want to return to it because it contains something strange. When participants chose which hand to move, they were asked to note which letter was on the screen when they first felt the urge to decide. That note, the letter, gave the researchers a timestamp. And what the data showed was that brain activity predicting the choice was detectable up to 7 to 10 seconds before that timestamp. Think about what that means. The participants were not unaware. They were watching the screen, waiting for the urge, actively attending to their own internal state. And still they reported the urge to decide approximately 7 to 10 seconds after the pattern was already present in their brains. Where were they in those 7 to 10 seconds? What were they doing while the choice was forming? They were waiting. They were in the antechamber of a decision that had already started without them. And they had no access to the room where it was happening. This is not about manipulation. It is not about damaged brains or unusual cases. This is ordinary, healthy people performing an ordinary task in a lab. And in those ordinary people, the most basic motor choices, which hand to move when, were tracking processes that ran outside the reach of awareness. Now, as I emphasized before, these were trivial choices. Nothing about this experiment tells us that meaningful life decisions, about relationships, about values, about who to be, work the same way. The Haynes result is real within its very narrow scope, but the narrow scope raises a broader question. If even the simplest choices trace to preconscious neural patterns, what should we assume about the complex ones? Are the complex ones where freedom finally appears, or are they just the same machinery running more slowly and with more inputs? Nobody has established the answer to that. But the question does not go away just because complex choices feel different. I said earlier that Sapolsky's argument traces any decision back through an unbroken chain. I want to take one full pass through that chain at a slower pace, because the argument earns its conclusion by accumulation, and it's easy to skip over a link and think you've found the gap. Start with the decision you feel you are making right now, the experience of choosing to keep watching or not. 1 second earlier, your neurons are in a specific pattern of activation. The particular configuration of signals across your prefrontal cortex, your limbic system, your reward circuitry, this is not neutral. It is already tilted. It was already tilted before the decision entered awareness. We know from the Libet result that motor preparation precedes awareness. There is no reason to think cognitive decisions are different in kind. 1 hour earlier, you were in whatever state you woke up in. The cortisol and adrenaline of your morning shaped by how you slept, shaped by what you were stressed about. Hormones are not trivial. Testosterone modulates confidence and risk tolerance. Cortisol modulates vigilance and anxiety. Serotonin shapes your baseline mood. These are not background noise. They are active inputs into the calculations your brain is running when you think you're deciding. 1 month earlier, if you've been sleeping poorly, your prefrontal cortex has been operating below its normal capacity. Chronic stress chemically alters prefrontal function, reducing what researchers call executive control, the brain's ability to suppress impulses and take long views. The you doing today's deciding is doing it with whatever computational resources your last month left intact. Years earlier, if your childhood included sustained adversity, abuse, poverty, instability, violence, your hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the hormonal stress response system, was calibrated by those experiences. The calibration that happened then affects how your body responds to stress right now, today, in ways that are not fully reversible by awareness or intention. Decades earlier, before birth, the genome you were given, the specific variants of your dopamine receptor genes, your serotonin transporters, the density and distribution of receptors that tune your sensitivity to reward and threat, was determined at fertilization. You were handed this instrument without consultation. Your entire adult life of deciding is being played on an instrument you did not choose. Further back, those genetic variants are the survivors of selection pressures that played out over thousands of generations in environments you never inhabited in response to threats your ancestors faced before language existed. You carry solutions to problems you never had. Some of those solutions are features. Some of them create the exact vulnerabilities that make your particular pattern of mistakes so consistent and so hard to change. At no point in that chain, not one, is there a gap. Not a moment where the causes pause and an uncaused you steps in and takes the wheel. Every layer you lift reveals another layer beneath it. The chooser keeps dissolving. What remains is a biological system running forward through time, generating experience as it goes, including the experience of being the author of what it does. This is Sapolsky's argument. I want to be fair. It is an argument. The conclusion that free will in the meaningful sense does not exist is contested by serious philosophers. Dennett and the compatibilists are not confused. They are making a different, coherent move. They are saying that free will was never supposed to mean uncaused, and that the free will worth wanting, acting on your own reasons without coercion, is entirely compatible with everything Sapolsky shows. The debate between these positions is live and unresolved. But here is what I keep coming back to. The compatibilist move is partly semantic. It redefines free in a way that survives determinism. That redefinition may be right. It may be the honest, pragmatically useful thing to do. But it does not recover the intuition most people are trying to protect when they say they have free will. The intuition that they could, in some genuine sense, have done otherwise. That they are the originators of their choices, not just the channels through which prior causes express themselves. That intuition, as far as I can tell, is what the chain of evidence keeps eroding. Let me push on one more thing before we turn to what this means for how you think about yourself right now. We have been treating you as a stable reference point, the thing that does or doesn't have free will. But the idea of a continuous self is itself something that warrants scrutiny. Your sense of being a single, unified, continuous agent is compelling. It feels like the most solid thing about you. But it is the product of a particular kind of brain process, a process that stitches together memory, anticipation, sensation, and narrative into the felt sense of a coherent person moving through time. That process can be disrupted. It can be altered by damage, by drugs, by sleep deprivation, by stress. Under certain conditions, rare but documented, the sense of continuity fragments, the sense of being the author of one's own thoughts dissolves. The boundary between self and not self becomes uncertain. These are extreme cases, but they suggest that what feels like bedrock is a construction, not an illusion, a real process generating a real experience. But a construction nonetheless, assembled moment to moment by neural activity, presenting itself as continuous when it is actually a series of stitched frames. You feel like the same person who woke up this morning. In most meaningful senses, you are. But the biological configuration that is you right now is slightly different from the one that was you then. Different hormonal state, different pattern of neural connections, different readiness thresholds. The self is not a fixed object that has free will or doesn't. It is a process that generates the experience of having free will, among many other experiences, and the status of that experience, its causal role, its connection to what the body actually does next, is what remains genuinely uncertain. The wave moves through the water. It is real. It can knock you over. You cannot hold it in your hand. I want to spend some time now on what all of this means, not for academic philosophy, not for courtrooms and legal theory, but for the ordinary business of how you think about yourself. Tonight, when you lie down, you will probably review the day. You will find things you regret, things you wish you'd done differently. You will have, in all likelihood, a sense of having failed somewhere, a conversation that went badly, a moment of cowardice or impatience, a choice that you know, looking back, was wrong. What happens to that feeling if you take this argument seriously? Here is the thing I want to be precise about, because the misreading is tempting. Taking this seriously does not mean deciding that nothing matters, or that your choices have no consequences, or that accountability dissolves. The consequences of actions are real regardless of whether the actions were caused. A fire burns your house down, whether or not the fire was caused by prior events. You still need to put it out. You still need to not start the next one. What changes is not the consequences. What changes is the quality of the contempt. The specific emotional texture of looking back at something you did and deciding that the person who did it is fundamentally bad, fundamentally deserving of punishment, fundamentally irredeemable, that requires believing that the person had a genuine uncaused choice, that at some point they were free, they surveyed the options, and they chose wrong in a way that was genuinely up to them. If they weren't, if the choice was the output of a causal chain they didn't originate, then the contempt becomes harder to sustain. Not because what happened didn't matter, not because there should be no response to harm, but because the moral rage of "you chose this and you deserve to suffer for it" requires a metaphysical backstory that may not be there. And this cuts both ways. The pride that comes from achievement the sense that you earn something, that your success is a reflection of your fundamental worth as a chooser, is the mirror image of the contempt. If you did not choose your intelligence, your drive, your circumstances, the specific dopamine response that makes hard work feel rewarding to you, then your successes are not less real, but they are less purely yours. They are the output of the same chain. Sapolsky's landing point is compassion, not as a sentiment, but as a logical consequence. If no one truly earns their worst impulses or their best achievements, then the moral architecture of blame and pride needs to be rebuilt with softer materials, not abandoned, rebuilt with the actual biology in mind. I find this both difficult and oddly clarifying. Difficult because the contempt and the pride feel like the most natural things in the world. Clarifying because, once you try to trace either of them back to their foundations, the foundations are less solid than they appear. I want to go back to Virginia, the man who walked himself into that emergency room, who told the staff his head hurt, who submitted himself to the scan that would explain what he had become. I keep thinking about that walk, the specific decision to go. Whatever was left of his prior self, recognizing that something had gone wrong, that he was not who he had been, that the gap between the person he remembered being and the person he had become was wide enough to need explaining. He chose to go, or something chose, wearing him. The tumor was removed, and the behavior stopped. The tumor regrew, and the behavior returned. The tumor was removed again, and what came back was something closer to the man he had been before, the steady, decent person his family and colleagues had known for decades. Which one was him? I don't think there is a clean answer. I think both configurations were him, in the only sense that matters. They were what that body did, in that brain state at that time. One configuration made choices we find monstrous. The other made choices we consider ordinary and decent. The difference between them was tissue. The difference between them was matter arranged one way versus another way. And the thing that strikes me hardest sitting with all of this is not the case itself. It is that his case is only unusual in its clarity. The rest of us are just more opaque. The forces that shape what we do, the genetics, the hormones, the developmental history, the 1,000 prior events that cut the valley our behavior flows through, they are always operating. We do not have tumors that make the mechanism visible. We just have ourselves, feeling free, feeling like authors, feeling like the choices are ours. Maybe they are. Maybe the compatibilists are right and freedom was never supposed to mean uncaused. Maybe Dennett's version is the one that survives contact with the evidence. Or maybe the feeling of authoring your life is the last thing that happens. A readout, not a lever. An echo of processes that already fired, real, vivid, irreplaceable, and arriving just after the decision has already been made. What nobody can yet tell you, what the neuroscience and the philosophy and the physics have not resolved, is whether the feeling is doing any work at all. Whether consciousness is the hand on the controls or the voice that describes very accurately where the plane has already gone. That question is still open. It may stay open, but I notice that right now, as this ends, you will have the feeling that you are deciding what to do next. You will feel the authorship of that moment, the sense of standing at a genuine fork with the next step genuinely yours to take. You cannot choose not to feel that, and that maybe is the strangest finding of all, not that you might be unfree, but that knowing it changes nothing about the experience of being you.